The lance is surely the dominant mounted cavalry weapon. Or is it? Why did so many people for centuries choose to use the sword on horseback instead of the lance? Why didn't everyone use lancers? Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now it should be fairly evident that a lance has hugely more reach than a sword does. You could even say it has more penetrative power as well. And in fact, many times we find historical accounts, and we're going to be looking at some historical accounts in this video, which describe the problem that cavalry armed with swords had when facing cavalry armed with lances. So why didn't everyone just switch to using lances? Well, in fact, the Germans in World War I kind of did. They did have swords as well, but primarily they were lancers, and there were many other forces and cultures in the world which were famous for using lances. So why on earth did some people, in fact you could say the majority actually in history, rely on the sword on horseback instead of the lance? Now I've got an awesome sponsor for today's video, which is Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. I know that thousands of you watching this video out there are going to be already massive fans of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So Tacticus is the game that you can play absolutely anywhere, sitting in the back of your dad's car or on the toilet. It means if you're a massive fan of Warhammer 40,000, then you can get your daily fix. But if you're just a general gamer, then this has also got something for you, because it's actually genuinely tactical. I absolutely love the mixture of shooting weapons and hand-to-hand, and I love the detail that you can't attack an enemy who's on a different level in hand-to-hand combat. You have to shoot. How well you do and how you advance depends on how you place your champions, and also which champions you build your team with and what attributes they have. You start out with Ultramarines, but you can choose any of the factions. In fact, currently there are over 80 legendary Warhammer champions to choose from, and there's 18 factions. There's a bunch of different game modes, including person versus person arena battles, but also campaign mode, and they're adding new features and events all the time. So if you're thinking you want to give this a go, you can now, absolutely free. That's right, you can download it for absolutely free using my link down below. It's in the description, also in the pinned comment, or you can use the QR code that's right here on screen. And as a special offer to get you started, then if you use the code HELLOJAN, because it's January, then you're going to get 2,000 gold straight away, 50 Blackstones, and this offer is available until February the 1st. But regardless of when you're watching this video or when you see this offer, you can download the game for absolutely free. I've been playing it, it's actually great fun and surprisingly tactical. So let's be absolutely simple and straight up here. The basic, single, obvious, biggest advantage of the lance over the sword is reach. Not only does it mean that the lance can outreach the sword one for one before they've made contact, before any parrying or attacking or else has happened, the lancer gets the first go. They get initiative essentially in D&D terms. So they get the first strike at the swordsman. The swordsman can only defend that first attack. But in addition to that, putting the lancer versus the, let's say, hussar with a cavalry saber on the battlefield, okay, the lancer has a greater reach against people with a bayonet on the end of a musket or a rifle, a greater reach against gunners who are trying to hide behind their cannon, a greater reach against people who might be elevated higher up or behind breastworks or kind of fortifications, anything like this. Potentially even against people sitting high up on elephants. Okay, so the lance has a greater reach compared to the sword. In fact, the reach of the sword was so much of a problem in some cases that swordsmen on horseback could not reach their adversaries. One of the most famous examples in British Army history is when fighting the Sudanese army in the Sudan campaigns of the 1880s and 1890s. The Sudanese found that if they lay down flat on the ground, the British cavalry with swords couldn't reach them. The British response? Use lances. I would argue that the second biggest advantage of the lance is penetration, okay? The fact is that throughout the 19th century and even earlier, we find accounts of people being hit by swords on horseback and not being badly injured, and sometimes not being injured at all. One of the famous examples I often reel off is from the Crimean War, the Battle of Balaclava, the charge of the Light Brigade and the charge of the Heavy Brigade which followed it. And there are accounts from that, but equally there's ones from the Napoleonic Wars, where swords failed to cut through clothing or equipment, and sometimes even failed to thrust through clothing or equipment because a sword blade flexes very much more than a lance does. A lance is a longer, more rigid, with an acute point and delivered with the point. So it is a more powerful penetrating weapon. It's more likely to go through armour. It's more likely to go through clothing and bodies. So whilst in some ways you might say that the sword might be more versatile at some things, the lance not only has longer reach, but also much more powerful penetration. Now, one of the really important factors is a lance is not monodirectional, but it is certainly more limited in the angles that it can attack from. So clearly, if I'm riding at high speed with a lance in front of me, the primary purpose is to deliver that point to the thing that I'm aiming at. However, I can aim at other things. I can aim at infantry down here. So if I'm high up on a horse and the infantryman's down there, I can aim on this side. I can also aim on this side. But moreover, I can aim everywhere, all around on this side, all the way round to the back. Now, famously, one of the weak spots, kind of a blind spot almost for lancers, is over here. And that's not to say that you can't deal with that. And my friend Zach Evans, in fact, demonstrates very nicely that you can actually take a lance over this way and deal with opponents around here by putting it underneath the other arm. And in fact, of course, the lance can be held like a spear, so you can use it all the way around here, pretty much 360 degrees. So don't only think about the lance being couched underneath the arm. Of course, it was often held like this and used as a stabbing spear, various angles around here, or indeed held overhand like that, or overarm, and can be used just like a spear would in any other situation from the horse's back. But that being said, the lance, as you can see there, is more unwieldy, generally speaking, than a sword. And if I'm on horseback here, the sword can easily move all around quickly to any angle without too much faffing around. The thing you've got to be really careful of is not hitting your own horse in the head. Absolutely no question, the major advantage of the sword is that it's multi-directional and very nimble. It can change direction and attack and defend in many directions in a small space of time. Being more wieldable and quicker to use, you can more easily put it into positions to defend you or your horse. Remember, if your horse is here and someone is using a spear or sword or anything else to try and offend your horse, you can quickly put your sword in the way of the horse's head or even round at the flank. You can even protect your own back. That way, this is called sword arm protect in the later Napoleonic manuals. So you can easily get the sword anywhere it needs to be to protect you or your horse. Not to say you can't do that with a lance. In fact, you can to some degree, but it's a much bigger and more cumbersome weapon to be able to do that. So in actual fact, you can do these sorts of defenses. It's shown in Fury as well with the lance, knocking up an opponent's weapon as we would do with the sword. But it is a bigger, slower and more cumbersome weapon to be doing that with. Now, there is the matter of extraction, or should we say getting stuck in opponents. Now, this is something I've been asked about a lot over the years. Now, clearly I don't ride. I'm not a tent pegger or a jouster. However, I have friends who are. I have friends who are polo players and jousters and everything else. In fact, my own daughter and wife both ride as well. Now, one of the interesting things is there has to be a method for getting your weapon out, just as there is a method for it going in. So if we are, for example, with a couched lance here, if you're thinking about the knight with a arrête, sometimes known as a lance rest, it's more of a stop really, for the lance here, we often deal with lances which break, and anyone who's seen jousting will have seen these lances going into the opponent's shield or breastplate or helmet, and they will snap off. So that's one way of not having to extract the weapon. But if this is, say, for example, a lighter lance, sometimes known as a lance gay, or a typical bamboo lance as used in the 19th century by Indian cavalry, or indeed a Napoleonic Polish lancer, for example, in Napoleon's army, then when the lance goes in, remember I'd be high up on a horse. As the lance goes in, you actually have to let it swing through and out, or around and out, as you ride past. So the penetrated target, the opponent, the enemy, would very often be spun around in their saddle or dragged off their horse, and be on the end of the lance, and you actually need to then, as you ride off, let them come off the end of the lance. If you watch tent pegging videos, so that would be aiming at something down low, this would be representative of an infantryman, for example. If you hit them down here as you go past, you have to let the lance go out and through like that. Now, the option if you're thrusting with the sword is the exact same thing, but because the sword is smaller and lighter, it's actually easier to go in and out, in and out. You know, if you're stabbing down there, in and out as you go through. So in many ways, again, this is more nimble and easier to do that. If you're passing past, does reach make that much of a difference? Very often it doesn't. So if this is a long enough reach to thrust, it's actually easier to extract the weapon out because you don't have a back end sticking out of it. It's lighter, it's shorter and everything else. But here's the big one, cutting. With cutting, you don't have to worry about this. If you're riding quickly past the target and hitting it, especially with a curved blade, it drags through and across the target. Whether you're cutting this side, whether you're cutting this side, whether you're cutting as you go past, you don't have to worry about the weapon getting stuck in the target most of the time, because a cut will drag through and naturally pull out. Now, something that people often forget is that cavalry have to operate in a number of different environments. They might be out in the open field, they might be in a desert, they might be on the plains, but what about if you're in woodland or jungle? Now, in those situations, if you're riding around on a large horse, your horse is navigating the roots and the branches and everything else lying around, the sort of brambles and all this kind of stuff, and you are moving around on horseback, so you're high up already, a sword isn't really a problem. If it's in the scabbard, clearly it's not a problem. If it's resting on your shoulder, ready to use, it's not really a problem. Now translate that to the lance. So clearly already, me just standing in a bush at the end of my garden here, if I've got a lance, that instantly becomes a problem when I go into anywhere with thick vegetation, branches, this kind of thing. Now you might say, okay, well you could just lower the lance down, and yes indeed that might be the sensible thing to do, to hold it down level next to the horse and work your way through the branches and leaves. But that does mean you can't be having it up here, and it does mean if it's down here, it might also still get snagged and tangled in things because it's still projecting in front of and behind the horse, or indeed it could even get stuck down something low down here. But additionally, if we have to fight, well, if we have to fight in this environment, I'm trying to navigate this lance in an environment where it's already stuck and I'm just standing here. A sword just isn't a problem using in this environment. You can use it all around and it doesn't really get in the way at all. So here's a literal scenario taken from the Indian Mutiny, 1857. The rebels, they've run inside this building, they're holed up in there. We've got to dismount off our horses because we've pursued them. There's no other infantry around. We're the cavalry, but we're going to fight on foot. We've got to charge into that building and take them out in the building. I've got a lance. So there is only one example I know of a lance being used in this situation by a very famous Hodson of Hodson's horse. And what he did was he set fire to the building, then he waited outside for them to run out and he speared them as they came out. But that's not taking the lance into the building, isn't it? It's forcing the enemy to run out of the building. Let's say this is a large brick building and we can't set fire to it. Clearly in this scenario, I can go into the building with a knife or a sword, in this case a cavalry sabre, and it's a useful weapon. A lance, a whopping great massive cavalry lance, is not a useful weapon in built-up areas, in buildings, even in alleyways. Now, of course, one of the points that comes up again and again in historical sources is while the lance initially, before the point of contact, seems to have the advantage, it's got a greater reach, it's got greater penetration, the swordsman can't hit the lancer until he's first dealt with the lance. However, this is the point that comes up time and time again. If you deal with the lance and you are travelling towards them, you are now inside the lance's reach. Now, this is a two-part response to that point. First of all, yes, that's true. Okay, so if you get past the lance point with your sabre and you come in, at that point your weapon can give multiple attacks if you're standing still on horseback. Obviously if you're moving quickly past, you might only get time for one slash. But at that point the sword now has the advantage over the lance. However, what I would say is if you're slow moving and in a melee, then in fact there are things that the lance can do. Okay, so if the lance point gets knocked aside there, one thing you can immediately do is bring round the back end and smash the person in the face or chest with the back end. Okay, the other thing you can do is if it gets knocked aside is you can actually bring the thing back, and when you bring the thing back like that, you're actually still at quite close range. Okay, so it's the same thing with fighting with spear on foot. If the person charges in, you can pull back the spear and still use it at close range. It's not as easy to do that on horseback with a one-handed lance, however you can do it. Okay, so your basic options are to pull the thing back and still use the pointy end, or if it gets knocked aside, to use the back end. But that being said, in a close-in melee one-handed, especially on horseback where you've got to avoid colliding the weapon with the horse, either the flank or the front end, this is a less wieldable weapon in a close-in melee, and in that situation the sword, which is able to move all around quickly and attack multiple foes and deal with multiple angles, is going to be the better weapon in the melee. So when trying to address the question of which is better out of lance and sword overall, bear in mind that that is multiple different questions rolled into one. One question is which is better out of a lancer and a hussar with a sword against each other. Okay, that's one question. Another question is which is better against infantry or other people on foot? Which is more versatile? Which is more versatile in a wider set of environments and circumstances? There's many, many different questions, so it's not easy to answer. But let's see, what do the historical sources say about this topic? So these sources are going to be read from, for example, Swordsmen of the Empire by D.A. Kinsley. In fact, there's several different books by D.A. Kinsley, some of which I wrote forewords and introductions for. But let's have a look at some examples of what they actually said in period. So these are the words of Captain Humbly, writing in the Journal of a Cavalry Officer, 1854. He says, many cavalry officers have questioned whether the lance is the best weapon for cavalry in India. The Sikhs have been known to receive the point into their bodies and then to kill their adversary by cutting him down. The Sikh could not extract the lance, nor had the lancer time to draw his sword. Well, that's kind of a bad outcome for both, isn't it? But it does highlight the fact that one of the problems with the lance is if it goes into the opponent, that might not stop them from hitting you back. My response to this point would be, well, that goes the same the other way around. You could say, well, I hit the person with my sword and they ran me through with their lance. So it kind of goes both ways. Although I would say, generally speaking, it's easier to defend with a sword than a lance. So this next source comes from General Voyle and Captain Sinclair Stevenson in a military dictionary of 1876. And it says, it is doubtful whether the lance is as effective a weapon for cavalry as the sword is. Its value in pursuit is incontestable. I'll come back to that in a second. But at close quarters, the sabre is a superior and more handy weapon. I completely agree. During the Sutlej campaign, some of the 16th Lancers in charging the Sikh infantry, this is the Sikh Wars, are stated to have suffered from wounds on the arm from sword cuts of the Sikhs. Well, what I would say is, again, that's a double hit, isn't it? Because so that's not good for the Sikh receiving a lance, and yes, it does illustrate that just stabbing someone, running them through with a lance doesn't stop you from being hit back. But again, we could flip that around. It's bad for both people. Coming back to the earlier points, which I think are more interesting, it's incontestable in the pursuit. What is the pursuit? It means when an enemy is routed and you are chasing after them. Okay? Now, is it true that the lance is better in the pursuit? I don't honestly know. I haven't chased routing enemies on horseback, but I can see that the reach of the lance and the fact that enemies might lie down on the ground might make the lance better. But what I would say is, and this is for anyone who doesn't know, this is one of the major roles of cavalry, is pursuing a fleeing enemy. And a lot of people at the time and now say, oh, what's the point of cavalry in World War I or in the Crimean War or Napoleonic Wars even? And very often, the role, apart from scouting, of cavalry was to pursue a broken enemy. So if you break them with artillery fire or musketry or whatever, and they start running, that is the perfect moment to send the cavalry in. And in fact, in 1917, this was one of the ideas for using tanks, was for the tanks to break, in this case, German lines, and for British cavalry to pour in behind the tanks and pursue the fleeing Germans. It didn't pan out like that. Ironically, not for any failure of the cavalry, other than the fact they weren't in the right place at the right time. But it could have worked, and I think it was a fairly good idea. So for pursuing, fantastic. I would argue lance or sword is less important than the fact that the cavalry are there ready to pursue. Now here we have another period source, an Alexander Tolma, writing his reminiscences in 1882. He says, in truth, the lance is a fearful weapon, especially in a charge. Yes, I agree. I think in the charge, that slamming, the lance is almost incomparable, paralleled only by firearms, and there were charges which were delivered with shot as well. But anyway, but experience has since taught me that an expert swordsman, we'll come back to that, when engaged in hand-to-hand combat, has the advantage over the lancer in that by a quick, dexterous parry and guard, he can slip under the lance, and then his adversary is once at his mercy. Yeah, but that takes a really good swordsman, and when we're talking about cavalry as a whole, most of them aren't really good swordsmen. So I think if we're taking average people with average weapon skills, the lance has the advantage, certainly in the charge, over the swordsman. And really in a one-on-one combat, the lance still has greater reach. So you need to be really hot on your sword skills to get past that lance's point. Now, I've made a big thing in this video of the penetrative power of lances, and I don't think anyone's arguing that that is a major advantage of lances. But a certain person by the name of Winston Churchill, who himself was an experienced cavalryman, he actually has an interesting point to make, and he says, and this is from his book from 1898, The Story of the Malacan Field Force. He says there is a danger of the lance penetrating too far when it either gets broken or allows the enemy to wriggle up and strike the lancer. This last actually happened on several occasions. Yep, I always say this with all weapons. So a great penetrating weapon like a small sword or an estoc or a rapier or a lance, one of the things that we have to watch out for is over penetration, which is exactly why a boar spear has lugs on it to prevent that from happening. So you don't want to penetrate so deeply that the opponent can just donk you on the head with their sword. Now this next one is from Captain Nolan, famously of the Charge of the Light Brigade. He wrote some very interesting things before he unfortunately met his demise at the Battle of Balaclava. But 15th Hussars, Captain Nolan, he says, a lance is useless in a melee. Yes, I won't say useless, but it's not as good as a sword. Anyway, he goes on. The moment the lancer pulls up with the impulsive power is stopped, that instant the power of the weapon is gone. I basically agree, although as I've shown, there are ways that you can use a lance in close, and people did. We have accounts of it actually happening. It's not just my theory. It's shown in treatises, but equally there are descriptive accounts of people actually doing that. But I think generally speaking, the kernel of truth behind what he's saying is true, that up close without speed, i.e. not at the charge, the sword is a much more dangerous weapon than the lances. He says the 16th Lancers broke into the Sikh squares at Aliwal, again during the Sikh Wars. And in the melee that ensued, these brave men attacked the lancers sword in hand and brought many of them low, for they could effect nothing with the lance. In the Second Sikh War, I've been told that our lancers often failed in driving their lances into a Sikh because they had shawls wrapped around them. I could tell them a better reason. It was because those who failed did not know that it requires speed to drive a lance home, and that it must be carried into the object by the horse. I agree with all of that. Okay, so it comes back to this basic point that the lance is incredibly dangerous so long as the horse is providing speed to the lance. It's really a weapon of the charge. In the melee, the sword is a much more handy and, I would argue, dangerous weapon. So this is the final example I'll give. It's a little bit later. So from the Afghan campaign of 1879 to 80. So in case you didn't know, the British Army invaded Afghanistan like many other armies that have invaded Afghanistan. It didn't go that great, but anyway, from 1878 to about 1881 they were active in Afghanistan. Of course, Afghanistan is above the northwest frontier of India, which was then controlled by Britain, so it was, you know, at various times it was an ally or an enemy. But anyway, in the Afghan campaign, the enemy threw themselves down when charged by cavalry, the enemy on foot this is, and slashed up with their heavy knives, that's a chura or kaiba knife, as the cavalry passed over them, inflicting in numerous cases mortal wounds on our men and horses. Swordsmen were unable to reach them with their sabres when they were lying down on the ground, but our lancers gave such a good account of the enemy that they quickly learned to dread the lance, which is undoubtedly the queen of weapons when employed against infantry. So this obviously tallies with lots of what I've said. I think hopefully with all of these points that I've mentioned and demonstrated, and the historical examples that we've looked at here straight out of the annals of history, this should be enough to demonstrate that the lance is dominant over the sword in a specific set of circumstances. When the horseman is moving at speed, in an open area, clearly on horseback, not on foot. However, when you get bogged down in a melee against other cavalry, then the sword comes into its own and probably has the advantage over the lance. It's not that the lance is completely useless, but the sword is much more useful. So the sword has certain advantages over the lance in specific scenarios, and I would argue on foot, for the most part, the kind of reasons that cavalry would have to dismount, for example, going into a built-up area and stuff like this, probably the sword is more useful than the lance most of the time. But there is one other situation where I think we have to acknowledge the lance generally has a great advantage over the sword, as what you're going to equip your cavalry with, and that is against infantry. And this also tallies with what we know about the Polish winged hussars, for example, Polish lancers, when used against pike blocks. And of course it goes even more in the case when you've got lancers against people with bayonets, because bayonets don't have as much reach as a lance, but bayonets have a greater reach than a sword. So yes, absolutely, lance is fantastic at the charge against other cavalry, or when pursuing broken enemy, or against infantry. And thanks once again to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. Remember, the download for free, links and special offer down below in the description and also in the pinned comment. And in addition to everything we've spoken about, you have to also remember that for a lot of history, one of the jobs of cavalry was to shoot with stuff, okay? So obviously we've got mounted archers, you've got people who threw javelins, you've got people that used firearms of various sorts, even lancers were often equipped with pistols, hussars with sabres were normally equipped with carbines, sometimes rifles. But nevertheless, the point is, if you have another job to do, like operating a missile weapon, it's not very easy to carry a lance. It's not to say there aren't ways and means. There were, in fact, certain ways of hanging a lance and carrying a lance if it wasn't in your hands. But generally speaking, it's a lot easier to do that if you're going to shoot a bow or shoot a firearm. It's a lot easier to have a sword and a scabbard, and then okay, now we've shot at them for a bit, now we're being told to pursue some fleeing enemy or to lead a charge. It's easier to then pull a sword out and do that than to go, where did I stick that lance? So lancers have to be a little bit more dedicated to being lancers than other cavalry are, who can just all wear a sword. And remember that lancers usually, at least most armies, also carried a sword as well. Anyway, I hope that's been thought-provoking. Did I miss some things? Get posting down below. It's entirely possible that there are aspects to this which I haven't covered, but hopefully the combination of looking at the practicalities of the thing in hand plus the historical sources, what I always try and do, marry the practical modern practice with the historical data. Hopefully that's given a fairly rounded view of the topic. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon, where I will continue to be Matt Easton. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.